Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. This is Judah Hoover. This guy over here is Chris Haddon, and this guy down here is Josh Weidman. Those two are hard money lenders. I am a realtor and an executive in the property management space. We are coming to you every day at noon with more great content with the Build and Grow with Real Estate show. If you're a regular listener and you tune in frequently, you know that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, we do content. Wednesday or Thursday, we mix things up and we have a guest on. And today's guest is Chris Haddon, no stranger to the show. I think that we've had him on before, but one of the things that he can talk about dovetails nicely with some stuff that with some stuff that we've been covering. So, Josh, why don't you kind of tee us up here a little bit and tell us about who Chris is and what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. So Chris Haddon is one of the founding members and principal at Hard Money Bankers. Chris is also an author and a businessman in a number of different aspects, and has, Chris, you can speak a little bit better as to, the shows that you've been on, the articles you've written and things like that. But, your resume is pretty extensive when it comes to being an expert in the real estate field and the business side of things.
Yeah, we've been around for a few years. First, thanks for having me on again. It's been a couple months. Good to be back. So I appreciate that. And yeah, we've started investing in real estate in maybe 2004 or 5 or something like that. We started lending shortly after that, which is what we've been focused on. Probably 80-90% of what we do is running HMB. We also have rental properties. We'll do a flip here and there. And yeah, we put out a couple books about business, also Property Hackers, which you're a co-author on that as well, about real estate investing. And then, so we try to keep it moving and have everything going in the right direction. So yeah, happy to talk about a couple topics that we've been discussing recently.
Yeah. So I saw a video that you and Jason did that was really, really on point. And it kind of mirrors some of the discussions I've been having with Jason recently on underwriting deals and underwriting loans, as it relates to like, what is the real value of the property, and people doing their own due diligence instead of, calling up and saying, well, my agent said I can get 200,000 on the resale on this thing, or, it'll appraise for, whatever amount. Really, kind of getting to the core of what a property is actually worth and how that is going to vary really significantly based on the operator, based on, the finishes, based on the area. And, a lot of times looking at comps really close to the property is a very relevant source. But, I wanted to bring you on because I really thought that was a great interview.
Yeah, for sure. A couple important points to that, but let's start with the problem at the beginning that we see with a lot of real estate investors, both, newer and more experienced, and lenders too, but that's another story, is that they're relying too much on third parties to get their values, right? Yeah. So getting information from third parties is great, like an opinion from an appraiser, real estate agent, whatever, like looking at tax record, all of it is data that we use, even Zillow. I mean, you use whatever you can get, but you always have to know that at the end of the day, the risk is yours. If you're buying the property, the risk is yours. And if anyone else is putting up money for it, they have risk too. The third party doesn't have any risk. They get paid $400 or $500 to give an opinion of value, right? They're not invested in this deal. And it's okay to use that information, but knowing the value is your job as a real estate investor. It is. And if you aren't on MLS actively comping properties, you're missing an important aspect of this business. And then we can get into some of the other stuff you're talking about. But it's just a very common thing. It's just very common that people.
I completely agree with you, Chris. I have a lot of people who they call me and they're like, hey, Jude, I want to be a real estate investor. Can you send me deals? And can you tell me if it's a good deal or not a good deal? And can you tell me where to get money? And can you recommend a contractor? And I'm like, wait a second. Like, what are you bringing to this deal? Like, I mean, and so I always tell people.
It's a good thing you're an honest guy. Because, I mean, if you're an agent, like an agent's job is to sell properties, right? Yeah.
Right. So you're exactly right. I could definitely do that. The other thing, I think, to simplify what you're saying, Chris, is, or maybe just say it a different way, is your job as an investor is to see value where others don't. Now you need to justify that value, and you need to have a reason for seeing that value. But if everybody else thinks a property is worth 200 when it's all fixed up in a beautiful shape, and you think it's going to be worth 300, and you're right about that, that's how you make money. But if a property is worth $200,000 and everybody knows it's worth $200,000, well, it's going to get bid up right up to value minus expenses, minus costs. And there's not going to be much margin in that deal. How you make money at real estate, how you profit from real estate, is by seeing value where others don't. And how you find value is by sharpening your skills of looking on the MLS.
Absolutely. I mean, one of many ways to find deals, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discipline that goes into passing on paying too much. People get a little rose-colored glasses when it comes to buying a property and on their resale price. And there's a lot of discipline that goes into passing on deals when they're too high. And also, of course, putting in that focus on marketing in many different ways you can get deals. I mean, from wholesalers, MLS, like mailers, like obviously we know all the different ways, but getting good at it, getting good at getting the right stuff under contract. And then after that, we can get into like what you actually do with it and how important it is to be an operator in that regard.
Well, and I think understanding the project and being able to articulate that to a seller a lot of times is the difference between sounding like a total jerk where you go in there and you're lowballing them, or you can go in and justify and say, hey, look, here's the real situation. You might put this on the market and 90 days from now it's going to close to an investor who's going to overpay for the property. But by the time you pay your closing costs and you pay this and pay that, you're probably going to get less. And better yet, here's why I have to pay this amount. This is why this is a good offer for you. And here's why it checks all your boxes and also mine. And I mean, last week we had Jason on from Integrity Property Group. They do 30 projects a month in the York and Central PA area. They're really big buyer and very big into direct from the seller marketing, or direct to seller marketing, and building those relationships. And I mean, that was one of my key takeaways from that discussion is like, look, if you're not explaining, if you're not building that rapport and that relationship with the seller, ultimately, at the end of the day, you're not going to get the deal. They're going to think you're trying to scam them. But you can't do that unless you have the knowledge and really understand what you're getting yourself into, I guess.
Yeah, and Josh, like I remember your presentation and your materials and all the stuff that you would do to explain all that, all the scripting that went into it. Like you really got that dialed in over the years. Top-notch stuff when it comes to presenting to a seller in order to close a deal that's good for all parties.
Well, exactly. So what are some of the things that you've seen, specific stuff that you can talk about, like instances? Have you seen properties that like out of your office that you guys are looking at lending on, or maybe have lended on, where the buyer thought the sales price was going to be 600,000, it comes in at 3, or something ridiculous that came back there?
Well, maybe not that much of a gap, like that's pretty drastic, but obviously we do have those conversations every single day, because another thing that newer investors, another mistake that they make is that they use the top comp in the block. They use the top comp in the market, which was done by some guy who's done 250 deals probably. In this person, maybe on deal 1 or 2 or 3, they're not going to turn out the same product, right? And that's when being the operator when it comes to construction and finishes and everything else becomes so important, because that top comp on the block, like they know their product. They buy stuff in bulk. They know exactly what goes in there, like what kind of finishes, like what do you need to do to it. And we've seen plenty of examples where people, they expect to get that 600K, but they do something that's going to get them 525, right? Yeah. Like they turn out a product that's going to get them 525. And one of Jason's famous lines has been saying for years is that if all 3 of us flip a property, we'll sell it for a different price, right? Because mine will probably be the lowest. Mine will probably be the lowest. That's not my area of expertise, right? That's not what I do every day. I'm a marketing and finance guy. I run a lending company. So that's important to know, because people are too rose-colored on that as well, right? They just go in and they're like, oh, it's going for 600. And my realtor told me, so there you go. There's a professional that told me, and that's what I'm going to get. So obviously you can see the problems there.
Well, and I was looking at a project over this past week. It was a tight timeline to close, and I mean, I've been back and forth talking to Jason on this, and it was really interesting speaking with the or potential borrower who was looking for a refi. He's closing on a short sale property, but wasn't able to, didn't have all of the cash he needed. He's putting a lot of money into the deal. Great property that he was buying, but he was using a second home, or I'm sorry, not a second home, but like another investment property that he was looking to refi out, that he owned free and clear, whatever.
Okay.
He kept telling me, you know, look, this is the value of the property. Look at all the comps. And it was in a vacation community with a bunch of lakefront properties. And this house was literally across the street, but it was on the wrong side of the street. Across the street, you have lakefront properties, you know, and right across the street, houses are selling for $600,000, $700,000, $800,000, but nothing in the community was selling close to that, you know, and it's easy enough. This is an experienced guy. This guy, he probably does 25 or 30 flips a year, and should know his numbers. But it just is, it's amazing to me how frequently, you know, we fool ourselves, or people fool themselves as investors. It's like, look, I got this great deal. Well, is it such a great deal? If you're not the first, you know, you don't get there 5 minutes after the house is listed, and, you know, it's 60 days into the listing and nobody's bought it, and you're like, oh man, this is a banging deal. Well, why hasn't anybody else bought it? You know, you got to kind of ask yourself, like, what did everybody else miss? What am I seeing that they missed?
Let's drill down on this a little bit. Chris, tell us what when we're looking for comps and we're on the MLS, or, you know, we're kind of looking over our realtor's shoulder and we're pulling comps or going to like icomps.com, or I know a number of people who they just go to Zillow, not necessarily for the Zestimate, though I think the Zestimate is closer than a lot of people want to admit that it is. So when people go to Zillow and they use it to pull comps, because you can get really good, you know, a lot of really good comps from Zillow. Talk to me about how you value a property and what you look for. Let's get into some nuts and bolts on what that looks like.
Yeah, I can talk about some of that. That's more of my business partner Jason's department, and also Josh's as well. But obviously, you know, even though it's not exactly what I do every day, we've been doing this for a long time, so I can certainly speak about it. So at first you have to look at where it is, like more generally speaking. Is it in a city? How's that going to work? Is it in a subdivision in the suburbs? That gets pretty easy. Is it not in a subdivision, but it's near one, right? Because then you start getting into the weeds a little bit about what's going to happen. And then you drill down a little bit more into property type and beds and baths and square footage and all of that stuff. And then use a number of tools. Like you mentioned Zillow, it's not a bad one, especially in the suburbs. It's like, there's some good data there. Definitely tax record. See what this place has sold for in the past. And then obviously the most important thing is having that MLS with the, you know, bright MLS in both of our areas. There's so many cool things with the different kind of searches you can do and pull it out here and there. And I've seen Jason do it. I mean, obviously we work in the same office, but also he's made videos of it where he'll have all the stuff up at once on different screens. He's on MLS, he's doing this search, he's got tax record, he's got Zillow, he's got Google Maps, he's walking down the street, right? And so he does this, you know, couple dozen times a day maybe. And so he's super quick at it. But it doesn't have to go that quick. We just run a volume business, and we have to do the stuff, comp properties, and give quotes all the time, many of them a day. But someone should use all that same stuff and take their time, right? If they're going to be putting a bunch of money into a deal, get all these factors together, right? Anything you want to add to that, Josh?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a couple things. It's nice to have a bunch of resources in front of you, and you should have a formula that you're using consistently on these properties. If you're saying, okay, look, we talked about this ad nauseum, really, about starting with what your finished product is going to look like, with the type of properties that you're going to be investing in, the areas. So you got to become an expert in those type of areas and in your backyard. So once you have that expertise, now it's really a question of, oh, okay, this place has an extra 200 square feet. What does that mean? Is it because they put a sunroom on the back? Did they finish, part of the basement? Was it, when they built the property, was it actually 200 square feet bigger because it was a different model and had an extra bedroom or something? You know, all these things, even though, you know, you've got properties in the same subdivision, in the same neighborhood, same city, even very close square footage, you can see, not everything boils down to the finishes, but all things being equal, the finishes matter. I mean, you certainly can't say that I'm going to get, top dollar if I'm using the cheapest contractor out there that does that does shoddy work. And, instead of putting in a high-end appliances and quartz countertops and, all of the accoutrements, you start cutting corners and it's like, oh, this laminate, it kind of looks like marble. They won't notice, like things like that. People notice, and oftentimes a few $1,000s, like less than $5,000 difference in the cost of the finishes can cost tens of thousands of dollars in the value of the finished product. So I mean, that's a big deal.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I would. The other thing that I think it's important to remember when you're looking at comping properties and you're looking at what you have going on is, you shouldn't try to be Mikey. This isn't baseball. It's not if we build it, they will come. You want to be investing, not speculating. And here's what I mean by that. Put out a product that the market is already used to and the market already wants, and not what you think the market could or would want to use. You can make a lot of money speculating, but especially for the first, year or 2 or 3 years of your career, don't gamble. Do what's tried and tested and true. And there's a bunch of examples of it, but the one that comes to my mind most readily is people who look to buy a property and they're basing their numbers on, okay, I'm going to buy this, I'm going to renovate it, I'm going to rent it out 4 rooms to college students, right? And there's a Penn State campus in every small town in America. And some of those Penn State campuses, student housing is a thing. And in some of those campuses, student housing really isn't a thing. People just live in a house, or they rent out a property and then they just kind of on the back end carve it up and rent it out to their friends. But it's not like the landlord themselves rents out the property per bed. So if you're in a per bed market, you can do that. If you're not in a per bed market, don't try to be the first person doing a per bed market. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
you understand what I'm getting at there, Josh?
Well, so I got another example for you. A friend of mine in Philadelphia, the guy's name's Josh Hertz. He's done a ton of flips. He got into new construction and had a really great lot. And he went to this architect and he's like, look, I want to build a 3-story property, 2,200 square feet. Gave him the whole rundown. Well, if you're familiar with Philadelphia, most of the houses are row homes, number one. And number two, most of the houses have a straight staircase along the right or left-hand side of the property that goes straight up, right? The architect comes back to him and says, you know what we got to do? We should do this, this newfangled staircase where you actually go up the stairs from the back of the house. And he starts describing all of this stuff. And finally, Josh looks around. He's like, listen, that sounds awesome. If you were designing my house, I'd be all for it. But here's the problem. I'm looking to make money. And like the bottom line is, this is what's selling. I know it's selling because it's all that's there. Why would we play around with something that is unproven, even though it sounds like an amazing design? Like, it's great to sell a lifestyle to a buyer. I love that idea when I'm designing or rehabbing a house. It's not good to, invent a fantasy for a buyer to buy, because, they walk through and they say, oh man, that's beautiful. And then they walk out and it looks like more of a piece of art than somewhere that they could live. So you're right. You got to follow the template.
Sales 101, whether you're selling cars, whether you're selling Kirby vacuum cleaners, whether you're selling real estate, is the confused mind says no. And if you've got a concept that kind of half makes sense in your brain, you've got to understand you're going to explain it less good than you understand it in your brain, and they're going to hear it less good than that, and they're going to internalize it and digest it. So, even if you have 100% grasp on something in your brain, by the time it gets to the person's brain, it might be only at 10% if it's a totally new concept to them. So I just avoid new stuff that's in the market. Steve asked a couple questions here and makes a couple good points. he says about, so you want the upgrades to complement the type of house and the neighborhood. That's exactly right. And I do walk the property videos where I go over that. Thanks for the shout out to that. He also asks, how would you have this information, resources or just experience? And I think one of the best resources that you can utilize on that is, number one, your hard money lender that you're going to. Number two, whatever realtor you're working with. Hey, I'm thinking about trying something crazy here with the backwards stairway. What do you think? And if your realtor's like, I don't know, because your realtor's going to be one who's got to list and sell this property. Also work with other investors. I got off the phone just the other day with an investor friend of mine who recently sold about 25 of his houses that he has in Harrisburg, York, and Baltimore. And he is now just doing flips. And in about the past 60 days has picked up 5 flips right in your backyard, Josh, is working on in the Baltimore or in the Palmyra Hershey area. And so, working with other investors is a really great resource. Any thoughts on resources versus experience for how you know what a market wants and comes up with value, either Chris or Josh?
Yeah, a couple things on that. I mean, some of the things you said before about Josh and that property, like there are definitely things that can only come from experience, and you can tell a seasoned investor when they say stuff like that. I mean, that sounds awesome, but I'm just going to go with what works. Like that's spoken like a pro. So some things will absolutely just come from experience, might even learn the hard way, and that's life, right? And business. But in addition to that, like we were saying before, like dive into everything you can, like realize that this is your job. Like determining the product as it sits now and as it's going to finish is the business. So like get into the weeds, get into the data, get into, do your homework about what's selling, what does it look like, what do I need to pay for it, the whole thing. That is the business. And I think that people oftentimes like gloss over that as like, oh, this guy told me, so it's good. It's like, use everything you can. Even we, like after doing thousands of hard money loans, we still chat with other private lender friends, like smaller hard money lender operations, like, hey, what do you think about this property in Northwest DC? Like, what are you getting on ARV on that? To this day, and we've done thousands of them, right? So use as many sources of data as you can, other people, stuff online, and always know at the end of the day, it's your money on the line. It's you with the risk.
Well, that's a big deal. It is your money on the line, even if you're not putting it up, because you're guaranteeing that. One thing that going back and looking at the data, a lot of times, not just looking at the properties that sold, look at the stuff that's listed, look at the stuff that's listed and not selling. It might be, hey, it's just not marketed well. Maybe they didn't take professional photos when they put the place up. Maybe, there's only 4 photos and they can have 60 or whatever the case might be. But oftentimes you'll see the reason. You've got, let's say you're in a development and, the high sales 325. But most of the sales are between 300 and 350. You got an outlier at 380. You got an outlier at 250. Well, look at the outliers first, throw them out, and then dig into the difference between that 300 and 350, and go through every single property that's sold in the last 2 years, and take a look at it. Make a couple notes. It's amazing what you can take away. It's like, oh, this place had a deck on the back. You can build a deck for $3,000 and it added 25 grand because I'm looking at another house, it's same square footage, very similar condition, and it's something small like that just so happens to create some competition or some desire in the buyer that wouldn't be there otherwise. And that kind of stuff's a big deal. One takeaway that I got from Jason, and I didn't understand this for the longest time, but it's the double yellow line. The double yellow line is like a highly trafficked road. And, in theory, I understood it, but when you actually look at the data on those properties, they're significantly less, they have significantly less value just because there's less desire to live on that lot, and so you got to take little things into consideration when you're evaluating these houses.
Yeah, I would say a couple things there, Josh. So whenever I'm looking at comps, and you've got like 350 and 325, that could be the, look for things like that could be the difference. It could be that, these have daylight basements and therefore they cluster around 350 And those that just have regular basements that don't have daylight basements cluster around 325. That could be the difference there. Also, properties are selling for 350 in that neighborhood, but with 6% seller's assistance. And when they don't get seller's assistance, they sell down here. And also look at days on market. Do all of the ones that cluster around 350 is the days on market 45 days, whereas the ones that cluster around 325 are they only 2 or 3 or 5 days on market? There's a lot of properties right now that are selling at 5 or 6 days on market. And I think that you can tell a lot. To me, when I'm looking at comps, it jumps out at me like a flashing red light if a property has more than 25 days on market. If a property is on the market right now for more than 25 days, it's either priced wrong or there's something wrong with it, or there's just something going on. So I think that that's the other thing to look at is, okay, my bedrooms and my bathrooms are roughly the same here, but what is there a feature? Oh, this, in this neighborhood, they built 1-car garages and 2-car garages, or, half of them have the attached garage and half of them don't, or it's around a lake, and those that actually have lakefront property, they have that, but those that don't, so you've just got to dig into it and make sure that you're not believing what you want to believe, but believing what the numbers actually say.
Yeah, I agree with you, especially these days. If a property's on the market over X amount of days, you got to find out that reason. And you typically can. You typically can find out why.
Absolutely.
One thing that you said earlier, Chris, that it just popped into my head, and it's something that has been recurring lately that I've seen. When COVID hit and a lot of the institutional backed and bank backed hard money lenders kind of exited the market, I feel like those that were left oftentimes had a lot more skin in the game with these loans and relied a lot more on their own intuition, as opposed to, if you're pushing out someone else's funds, you're going to be a lot less critical of the deal and a lot more dependent on an appraiser's value, as opposed to if it's your own, it's your own capital that's going out there. And I think
Absolutely.
that what we've seen more recently is, you can see it in, yesterday, we had Brian on from Note School, who he was talking about a retraction of capital in the banking markets, just in general across the board, where, we're at like 2012 levels for the amount of capital that's being pushed out the door and available on low down, no money down mortgages. So it's very interesting to see that across the board. It's like the market's changed. People are looking more closely and they're being a little bit more accountable to the values that are coming back and what they're lending, and just requiring more skin in the game.
Yeah, totally. Like we've seen that across like a number of different aspects, like lending, residential real estate, commercial stuff. And understandably so. We were riding a hot market for a long time. Pandemic comes along. It's our first pandemic, anyone in our generation, right? Yeah. Or in a few generations. We didn't know what it would do to the market. Like we never had a shutdown like that. Like we just didn't know. And so like, obviously everyone's on high alert mode. And then we saw like things started opening up, and then the spring market happened in the summer instead of the spring. And then we saw things were okay, especially in residential. And then we're like, okay, we need to be careful. We need to do smart deals, but business is still happening. It's still there.
Yeah.
And like, it's not all that different than before. You have to do good deals. The people who pulled back so much is because they were overly aggressive before that. And like you said, it's easy to lend out someone else's money when you aren't responsible for it. Right. And if you are responsible for it and your actual money is mixed into all that, then, we've always been more conservative. Right.
Yeah.
So that's the job.
It's funny. I tell the story a lot, Chris, where I always thought I was an honest loan officer. You know what I mean? And I was a loan officer for about 3 years, 2 to 3 years before I started in the hard money space, actually lending out my own money. Mm-hmm. And as soon as you start lending out your own money, it's amazing how much you catch yourself before you didn't want to know things, you know what I mean? And you didn't follow up on questions and you weren't like quite as curious. As soon as it's your money on the line, you're like, wait a second, tell me, you just said something there that leads me to think something here. Tell me a little bit more about that. You know, you dig a little bit deeper when it's actually your money. And I was surprised to find that about myself, because it's not like I would say that I was, you know, dishonest before. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, in essence, it's a different job. Like in that loan officer position, your job is to get loans approved. And how are you going to do that? Obviously following the rules and being honest and everything else. And then you go from a loan officer to, in essence, the underwriter. Right. And now you're picking it apart. It's a different role within the lending process. And yeah, being responsible for the capital, it changes the game for sure.
Yep, absolutely.
As it should.
Well, this was a great interview. Chris, Josh, any parting comments here before we wrap up?
I have one more piece of advice to some newer investors before we close up. Going back to the idea of proper execution on deals. If you're newer, do one deal at a time, just one, and do it as best as you can, and make your money and get another one. Too many people fall into the trap of like, I bought a deal, I'm about to go buy another one. And then you're just going to do more deals, not as well. So don't fall into that trap.
Right. If that deal of a lifetime comes across your lap and you can't help but get it under contract, wholesale it. You know, like it's perfectly fine to, while you're working on a deal, wholesale one or two deals if they just so happen to come along. But yeah, you're exactly right, Chris. Not getting distracted by the next shiny object is really important. Hey, so Josh and I are going to be hosting Brian with Note School. We're going to be doing that on October 10th from 10 a.m. till 3:30 p.m. It's basically an all-day event right from the comfort of your living room or office or couch. It's a Saturday, and you want to get registered at noteschool.com/BGRES, the Build and Grow Real Estate Show. We've got a lot of great stuff coming from this show. Josh and I are really trying to grow this and develop it because of the amazing feedback that we've been getting from you, our dear listeners. And don't for a second think that Josh and I don't recognize you, don't appreciate you. It's very meaningful to us when you like this show, when you share this show, when you comment on this show. And we just really appreciate that. And our heartfelt thanks go out to you. And a really great event that is coming up that you're going to be able to participate in is noteschool.com/BGRES. We've got a bunch of people who are already registered, and I would just encourage everybody else to go ahead and get registered.
Yeah, and it's not going to cost you a thing.
Right. It's totally free to get registered. A lot of other promoters are out there charging $5, $7, $10, trying to make a little bit of money on the door for this thing. And that's just not how Josh and I do things. So we definitely want everyone to participate, and it's for everybody. So we'll be back tomorrow at noon with more great content. Thank you very much, Chris. And we'll see you guys later. Chris.